pace of missile testing has gone, from your perspective, like this. Just tracking all of the missile tests from not only Kim Jong-un's regime, but his father and his grandfather, and it's just gone way up. He's done more in the last couple of years than all previous years for North Korea combined. And it's not merely the number, of course, but also the characteristics, not really the range, but other characteristics as well. The fact it's solid fuel, the fact it may be more mobile, and these kinds of things. And the motors tested, not really the range of the particular missiles tested, but the fact that those motors could be combined and configured in different ways. So let me come at this. I'm going to talk about 7 key issues that I think the Trump administration will have to wrestle with for missile defense policy broadly. The first is it's going to come at some of the large strategy and budget questions. From the strategy side, I think it's fair to say that really, I think like my friend Michael Hanlon was just emphasizing, a lot of continuity, probably will be a lot of continuity. Notwithstanding significant programmatic vacillation and significant budget changes between, say, Bush and Obama, on a policy level, our approach to long-range missile threats to the United States in particular has had a lot of continuity. And so I suspect that that's not going to change. What we have done to have a kind of limited but effective missile defense against certain kinds of threats to the United States that has nevertheless strategic effect. There are some countries in the world with which we do not want to live in a deterrence relationship or a mutual vulnerability relationship. And I suspect that kind of general strategic posture relative to the missiles of North Korea, relative to the missiles of Iran, is unlikely to change. And if so, however, right, just keeping that general strategy is going to require increased effort. Not just sitting on what we've got right now, but it's going to require, on the homeland missile defense side, both capability improvements and also, by the way, capacity improvements. On the second half of that, the budget question, I would note that the Missile Defense Agency, the material developer for most of these things, is down 24% in its top line budget in the past 10 years. Right? Down 24%. So the North Korea missile testing is going this way, and the missile, if you have my graphs, it'd be great. And the budget for all this is going down. It's really, it's not going in the right direction, suffice to say. Let me point to one other thing, not the Missile Defense Agency, but the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, back in late 2013, issued a document called Vision 2020, the Joint Staff Vision for Integrated Air and Missile Defense. Well, the idea was the United States would have, relative to the emerging threats from a lot of different places, across a whole spectrum of low-tier rocket, artillery, mortar, cruise missile, anti-ship missile, and on up, we would need to come at that in a more aggressive way. Well, guess what, folks? 2020 is getting a little close to where we are today, and we have not been taking the actions to execute that vision that he expressed in 2013. So that Vision 2020, in these kind of budget levels, that's going to be more like a Vision 2035. But in the meantime, the threats are not going to keep up with our budget delays. The second big question is the relative priority of homeland versus regional missile defense. And on this one, I'll try to describe the graph. In 2009, the attention to homeland missile defense went like this. And the budget attention to regional missile defense went like this for the Obama administration. And it really kind of switched to priorities. As a formal proposition, homeland missile defense has remained a priority in the United States, but the budget kind of tells a slightly different story. And so I think one big muscle movement that we might expect in the budget for this year is increased attention to homeland missile defense. And again, if your strategy towards North Korea and others is to outpace the threat, not chase it, but to outpace it, then we're going to have to do more in that realm. And frankly, I think whoever would have won in November probably would have inflected that curve in terms of the relative trade-off between homeland and regional. The third big question is going to be, how do we think about missile defense relative to Russia and China? And we heard just now from Mike and from others in discussion, you know, the importance of kind of communicating that THAAD is not directed or oriented to China, and of course that's all true. One THAAD battery translates to about 96 interceptors co-located with it, and that just ain't enough to really affect, you know, 1,000 or more short-range missiles that China could throw if it wanted to. And so, you know, in the scheme of things, it's not even a close question. I'm going to come back to the Aegis question. I have a slightly different take on that. But having said that, in terms of communicating to Russia and China, what is our posture? I think it's actually pretty important that we not overstate or misstate what U.S. policy has been. Under both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the United States has scrupulously refrained from any binding limitations on capability, capacity, or characteristics of our missile defense sensors or interceptors. That, I think, would be important to retain. Furthermore, the 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review is often, I think, misunderstood on this point, said that while U.S. missile defenses, long-range missile defenses, are not intended and not capable of affecting the strategic stability with Russia and China, they're not intended and not capable, that nevertheless, we will not forswear the use of missile defenses against a threat missile, even if it on the side of it is painted in Cyrillic or Chinese characteristics. So, you know, in fact, that document said that we would even use our long-range missile defenses against those kinds of threats. I think that the big question, therefore, is going to be, look, we're not going to necessarily pursue the kind of SDI, the early SDI vision. But having said that, the United States has not, over the past 2 years, forsworn the use of especially regional missile defenses against either Russian or Chinese non-strategic missile threats. And so one of the big questions, and it's been percolating here on the Hill quite a bit in the past couple of years if you're looking at the legislation, one of the big questions is non-strategic air and missile defense for NATO. But that has an Asian-Pacific analog. And so just as we have never forsworn the use of regional missile defenses to protect the U.S. fleet, to protect our allies from missile threats of any source, I suspect you're not going to see any new limitations on what the United States will and will not do. Now, with respect to THAAD, right here, I just wanted to have a little injection here. As Mike, I think very rightly noted, you can't, let me put it this way, back in Desert Storm, this was back after 1991, one of the generals on the ground there said, kind of looking forward, what captured the imagination, the Patriot experience, he said, but you will never have enough Patriots in the world to cover an area. The defended area is simply too small. And so that's one reason why THAAD, or multiple THAAD batteries, as I heard somebody say earlier, is really going to be necessary to cover even a limited defense for the Korean Peninsula. With respect to the Aegis question, however, I would say the answer to whether Aegis is a substitute, it was you, sir, who I think asked that. The answer to that is yes and no. If by Aegis you mean the SM-3, which most people think of as Aegis, the answer to that is no. That is an interceptor that only works outside the atmosphere. And for this kind of distance, you're going to have such a depressed trajectory, presumably, or potentially, that it's going to be outside the atmosphere looking, opening its eyes, and the stuff that the threats are flying beneath it. If by Aegis you mean Aegis ashore, equipped not with SM-3, but with SM-6, more of a terminal and lower tier interceptor for in the atmosphere, then you have a different story. And by the way, the U.S. government just greenlighted foreign military sales for the SM-6. That's a big deal. And South Korea, I think, is a potential customer for that. It would make a lot of sense if they're doing kind of Aegis stuff on ships. That frankly, SM-6s are a lot cheaper, and they can defend within the atmosphere. That's a good thing. You could also, by the way, put a lot of even cheaper and even shorter range interceptors in the same launcher. But going back to the SM-6, because we're still in that number 3 Russia and China thing, if you think China's mad about THAAD, they would go bananas, I mean even more bananas, about not the missiles, but the launchers that Aegis Ashore uses. Why is that? Because those are the same launchers on Aegis ships that launch Tomahawks. So actually, I kind of like the idea. Let's present it to China. You pick. Do you want THAAD or do you want Aegis Ashore? I'd be up for that. Next, the fourth big question is future of NATO missile defense. Obviously, this is going to be derivative from the kind of overall posture that this administration takes relative to Russia. But I think that if you look at the action, say, at the last NATO summit in Warsaw, the 28 members of NATO in Warsaw really kind of came around to the fact that we now have a Russian problem. Where we still have not come to admit to ourselves is that we have a Russian missile problem. Although that New York Times story from just a couple weeks ago about the Lickham and the sort of blatant INF violation, I think is probably going to inflect that curve. And there was just some legislation introduced here in the Senate this week directly going after that as well. The first A in EPAA stood for adaptive, right? And I think it's going to be important that the United States and its NATO allies together adapt to the fact that there's a new threat, a new regional threat to our NATO allies, and that is Russia. This, of course, has a trans-regional effect, right? Once I think we begin to slaughter some of the sacred cows here in the air and missile defense realm, we begin to think a little bit more differently about missile defense in the Asia Pacific as well. Finally, the next one rather, the fifth main question is allies and partners. And I think this actually fits very well with some of the things that President Trump said during the campaign season last year and has said since, that we ought to, in a way, expect more of our allies and partners. And this, I think, is a right area for that kind of increased activity. This could take a lot of forms. I think actually this administration, one thing that ought to think about is a strategic initiative for trying to make certain kinds of foreign military sales cheaper and more attractive. And by the way, not really doing it on a one-off basis, but looking for transnational and even trans-regional bulk buys. So THAAD sales, and there's going to be a lot of THAAD sales I expect in the Middle East in the next couple of years. That might actually bring down the unit cost. And in terms of production, if you bring it down in one region, you bring it down in others as well. The U.S. Army can benefit, as well as our potential allies and partners. But also, for putting aside FMS, I think a lot more opportunities for co-development and co-production of different things is going to be important. We might also, by the way, consider the kind of active proliferation of those very launchers that I was describing earlier, the Mark 41 launchers. Put a lot of empty launchers in a lot of places so that if you really needed to, you could fill them up. It's kind of forward deployed launchers. A sixth area is next generation technology. And here, I think it's unfortunate, but the appropriation committees have all too often cut the very areas of focus on missile defense that have some of the greatest long-term potential. That's in part lasers and other directed energy weapons. Things have come a long way since 2009 when an airborne laser shot down several missiles successfully. It's actually advanced quite a bit since then. A couple other options there, including most particularly, I think, a space-based sensor layer. And finally, let me say the seventh and last big issue that I want to throw out there is that we've got to think differently about missile defense. Most of the THAAD question is this giant $1 billion question mark. But we've got to find a way to make our capability deployments, our additions of capability at the margin, a lot more agile and a lot more flexible. And what I mean by that is, in part, we're moving towards any sensor, any shooter capability, where rather than having lots of different assets, a TPY-2 radar, 96 interceptors co-located with a big price tag attached to it, what we might want to think about is kind of the splicing and dicing. The ability to co-locate different kinds of interceptors in the same location. Maybe even have different types of missiles in the same box. Kind of a layered defense in a box, as it were. Mobile boxes, mobile launchers, that can then be moved around with greater facility. You begin to do that, and you begin to, I think, one, lower the cost curve, allow yourself to have cheaper ways to intercept while retaining your longer-legged things as well, and you begin, I think, to really add capability. Those are the 7. I'm going to leave it off there, and hopefully we can talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Okay. Come here. Okay, Tom, you have something to say?
I just have a few questions about the efficacy of the entire concept of missile defense as it has been pursued by administrations after administration. And that is, let's take an example of THAAD, for example, and deployment. The rationale behind the deployment of THAAD battery to South Korea is that not to defend the entire territory of South Korea against the possible threats from North Korean missiles, but U.S. forces there first. And that was the same idea when they first mobilized, deployed the Patriots, so that was the same idea. And possibly include the U.S. forces and also staging and launching and staging areas where U.S. reinforcement forces would come that are targeted by the North Korean attack, so that protect those areas. Now,